Hi, Sven here. Over the past few weeks, I have been deeply involved in a project creating a 100% automated podcast. This podcast, as you can already see here on the website, is called KI Briefing Daily. A new episode is released every morning at 6 o'clock, and each one is about 5 minutes long. And in every episode, the 4 most important news stories from the world of AI are published. And for me, it's really exciting to experience how I sit at the breakfast table every morning at 6, eagerly waiting to see which news stories have been selected this time. In this video, I'll show you how I create this podcast and how the whole thing works. I'm Sven. I'm an entrepreneur, and I've been involved with quality and process optimization for over 30 years, not just professionally, but in all areas of life. I've learned a lot through trial and error, and I know what really works. Today, I run a group of companies with several software firms, and through my videos, I want to show you how you can successfully use automation and AI in your own business. So let's get started. I built the whole project as usual with Make an Airtable, and I also used the service Polity, and how the whole thing works and how it's all connected, I'll show you right here in the following. In the background, you can already see the process. It's actually a long process that doesn't branch off or anything like that, but instead runs straight through every morning in one go. But before we take a look at the details here, let's first go into the Airtable that I set up for this. In Airtable, I created a separate base for this, and there are 4 tabs, starting with the first one. There we see things like, what's the name? What is the title? What is the description? Who is the author? Then I created some placeholders here for the episode titles and subtitles, the episode description, and how the overall structure works in terms of the text. Then when it started and the episode number, for the episode number, I chose the day of the year, making sure that it has to be sequential. That means now on January Honest, which is coming up soon, it doesn't start with 1, but rather with 366. Yeah. Then on the second tab, I have the feeds from which the news comes. I'll get back to that in a moment. On the third tab, there are the different episodes that have been published here. So the first one was, let's see, on November 25th, and today is the 29th. And that's why there's a new row here every day. And last but not least, the selected news. There are always 4 of them. And here again, we can see on the 29th of December, 1, 2, 3, 4. These 4 news items were published in the podcast today. So how does the whole thing work? First of all, the Airtable module called Get a Record is used to read or retrieve these podcast data entries from Airtable. This means it accesses the specific table where all the podcast information is stored and pulls out the relevant data for further processing. Specifically, I just have a fixed entry here. Yes, I'm reading from the podcast table. There could be several entries in there, but I just made a fixed entry here. Then this data is read out. And at first, I need to set various variables. Let's take a closer look at which ones those are. So I always want to have the last 24 hours, since this is executed in the morning just before 6 o'clock. That means I take today -1, starting from 6 o'clock. So the whole thing is always searched from 6 to 6, from and to. So I take up to today at 6 o'clock. Then I also need the current day. We'll see later where that's used. Then here I also have a variable for 1 week back. I'll come back to that later as well, why I need to go 7 days back from today again, in order to secure something here. I'll explain that later. Then I use Polity as my podcast hosting system. For that, I need an API key, which I set here. The ID of the podcast, that's the podcast number. And then I also create the episode title here. So what happens here is that the title, which comes from Airtable, is combined with today's date written in the German format. And then I also create a file name for the MP3 file that is generated, because I save it in case I ever need it again. So those are the variables that are set for now. We'll see in a moment which of these we need and how we use them. The first thing is that I make an entry in Airtable for this current episode, right? That means I use the episodes table. There I enter today's date, then the season. I calculate that myself. So for example, in 2025, season 2 will come out here. And the day of the year is actually today's date in 3 digits. Now, so today it should be 363. And in the future, I'll have to add 365 here, and otherwise nothing else is entered here. Next, I read the RSS feeds, and that was actually quite a complicated process. I'll go over to Airtable again. I looked at about 40 or even more RSS feeds or news sites, checked out sites. And what I really wanted was to get only feeds where only AI news is published, so where there is actually a filter for AI. And if we take a look at Heise, for example, which is a well-known news site, you can access this RSS feed that is specifically about AI. And when I fetch this RSS feed, we can actually see here that there are only AI news items. Yes, AI, OpenAI, and again, OpenAI, and so on. And that's why it's really convenient that I've selected the right RSS feeds here. And actually, it was a huge effort. And in the end, I selected these 10 feeds, some of which are in English, and now they're being read here from Airtable. So let's just take a quick look inside. So I'm not selecting anything here. I'm just specifying the feeds table with a maximum of 10 entries. And then I run a loop over that. And with this RSS feed, I now search through these URLs, meaning these 10 different feeds, using the from date and to date, so the last 24 hours from 6 o'clock yesterday to 6 o'clock today. And here as well, I select a maximum of 10 items, and that also runs in a loop. And the found Umare, there are actually any titles here, and the news items that are found are then compiled into a JSON document, specifically just the title, the summary, if it even exists, and the URL where the news item comes from, because it's also important to me that for every news item, I always know what the original source actually was. So, and if you remember earlier with the variables, I set them back by 7 days. And here I simply noticed the following problem. I didn't have that included at all in the beginning. What happens is that sometimes the same news item is published on different news portals on different days. And if my algorithm then selects it, it's obviously annoying if the same news item gets published on 2 or 3 consecutive days. That's why I read out the news from the last 7 days from the episode. And yes, I filtered it accordingly here. You can see it here, the 7 days back, and the episode should fall within this time frame. And then I have this data, these episode data also in a JSON document here, where I simply have this summary included. And now in the next step, I can remove all duplicate messages. For this, I use ChatGPT. And then here I have Alm, just a moment. It takes a second. So then I assigned it a role here, podcast editor and so on. And you can perform semantic analysis of messages. And that's why when if they're published on different platforms with different texts, you can still recognize that they're duplicates. Yes. And then here, 2 JSON documents. The first one is a title summary. The second one is the titles of older messages. And now it's supposed to compare them here and filter out all duplicates from these messages. And yes, then return the result. I also set the temperature to just 0.2 here because it shouldn't make anything up, but rather work on this task in a very factual manner. So, and now I've filtered out the duplicate messages, and I actually noticed that there were often quite a few duplicates in there. And now in the next step, I typically have between 20 and 40 or 35 messages. And now I have to select the 4 best messages from all of these 4 is just the number I decided on that are the best. And what makes them the best? Well, that's obviously not so straightforward. That's why this is also about the topic of target audience and so on. I said you are a podcast editor, you have subject matter expertise, and so on. And in this task, you now receive the titles, summaries, and URLs of the news items. Now it should analyze them and identify the 4 that are most useful for the target audience. And for the target audience, I simply defined it as people who are interested in AI but are neither experts nor tech professionals, which also has a bit to do with the language used. Yes, then translate the titles into German, not sensationalize. Then I want a justification for each article explaining why it was selected. And then there are a few more restrictions here, and then ChatGPT gives me the result back in this format. So specifically the title, the short title, the URL, and the justification. And this justification, or rather this information, is something I use again as well. Let's just quickly take a look at the episodes here. No, wait, that's not right. I actually need to go to the news section here. There we can also see the justification. The article highlights the trend toward more efficient AI models and so on. So that's the reason why this news item was selected. After we've selected these news items, no, there are only 4 left. We create a loop here. Let me just make this a bit bigger, smaller. So that means we're creating a big loop here. And within this loop, we now have to process these news items completely. And the first thing is that we go through these 4 news items and then read each one first. And you've already seen this RSS feed earlier. There's actually a lot of, well, basically junk in there that I can't really use. That's why I first have to read this URL here, pass the response, and then remove all the HTML formatting. Yeah, there's nothing much in there. It's just the data that was read. Remove HTML. And now, again, I've used the ChatGPT module here, and now I'm extracting the news item from this text. And that's really just a simple, straightforward process. For that, the mini system is enough, namely the news text historian expert who can identify which part of the text is the actual news item. And then it says here, I don't want any sources, no footnotes, no menus or links, which are usually found on such a website. And then it should also be determined here where the news actually comes from. So not, for example, from Heise, but rather who is the original author of the news, like OpenAI or whoever it may be. And then I simply have these data returned to me, and now I have the actual news headline. And then in turn, I have that converted once again by a ChatGPT module into a text that can be read aloud, because the problem is a factually written news text is, it's just not that easy to read aloud. It just doesn't sound that cool. And that's why, again, podcast editor, who are you? What can you do? What do you know? And then here comes a very detailed description of what it should actually do. Yes, for example, that it shouldn't say something like, today we're talking about, and how should the listeners be addressed? There shouldn't be any questions asked. I also don't want any kind of political statements in there. And then a few intros that it can choose from and so on. And that's how this dry news text becomes a text that can be read aloud. It was also very important to me that this text is not distorted in any way. So the content of the news should, of course, remain the same. Then these AR articles are then written into the table. Let's take another look at the table. So what do we see here? We have the short title, the date, what is the actual source, what is the title. Here is the URL. That means I can always access it directly from here. Then the justification, and then the actual news text, which is the original text that was taken from the source. Yes. And after this loop has run 4 times, the article is then edited by the editorial team. And now we have all 4 texts here combined into one long text. And well, I've noticed that they always end up sounding quite similar. And if you've listened to the podcast, you'll notice this, and I'll change it again in the future. You always hear things like an exciting piece of news and attention and so on. And that's why I added another module here, which reviews the entire text for content and edits it editorially, right? So for example, edit text for the podcast. Of course, it should be exciting and easy to understand. And now it receives instructions here on how the text should be revised. Also, any specific terms that should be simplified, for example, What is an EC2 Ultra cluster? Hardly anyone knows that, but if I have it say cloud server instead, it might work quite well. So I have these texts returned to me here, and now I have another special module here, namely the problem with these texts is that they sometimes contain special line breaks and things like that. And these texts, when I later pass them to Podigy, to the API, it can definitely happen that it causes a crash. And that's why I need to safeguard these texts. And this safeguarding works by here replacing certain specific characters in the texts. So for example, here with the replace function, I replace a double quotation mark. This is related to the JSON documents, which always start and end with double quotation marks. And then there's simply the problem that if there's another double quotation mark in the middle, well, then it just crashes because the system thinks, well, that's actually the end of the text. So, and that's why I have to revise all these texts. Here the title, the subtitle, and also here the description. And then there are also the show notes. And the show notes are especially long because in these show notes, I also include the why. And then down here, I also have the show notes in markdown formatting. So with the asterisks and so on, it all looks pretty wild, but in the end, it results in properly formatted text. The whole thing is then written back into Airtable. I'll spare you from having to watch that again now. Then I noticed another problem, namely that the system apparently can't pronounce certain date values correctly. So if it says 29.12/2024, sometimes it comes out as something like 9/25/12/420. And that's why I ran a very small ChatGPT command here, a prompt for demonstration purposes, where I basically and essentially say, phrase the date as if today is, and so on. So that in the end, we actually have a text that can be spoken out loud. And I have to do the same for a few other things as well, for example, for percentage rate. Sometimes with 87.5%, some gibberish is produced as well. And that's by 11 labs. So I pass the entire text that is to be spoken to 11 labs. I've also chosen a specific voice there that sounded quite fitting to me, the multilingual model. And here are the corresponding texts now. So that's the beginning, then the short titles. Then I always have a short pause here and then the detailed title. You can then adjust the parameters here, and then the text is converted into an MP3, and I upload this MP3 to my Google Drive. Theoretically, I don't really need that anymore, but I thought it might be pretty cool to keep it somehow so I can maybe identify a problem later on if one should occur. So after we've done all that, the actual podcast is now created. And for that, we have 6 individual steps here from Podigy. Podigy is a podcast platform. I'll just quickly show you. There, I can create an account and I can host all my podcasts there. You can see that here, for example. This is KI Briefing Daily. Here are all the episodes. All of them are published here, and each episode has its own details. I can just open one right now because it might be interesting to see that. So then I have here, there is the actual episode. Then I can make some general settings here, and these settings, those are all the text that I generated. For example, as I just showed, these show notes in Markdown, which are then published here. Yeah, and then you can also do things like transcript, feed, and all sorts of other stuff. So Podigy has its own API, and I can use this API directly from Make. That's why all of this here was created using the HTTP module. And let's take a look at the individual commands. So first I have to create a new episode, right? For that, I simply use the corresponding URL. You can find all of this in the documentation. Then I need the API key, which I already set up as a variable earlier. And then there are always some required contents that have to be passed to this API call. So in this case, both the title and the podcast ID are variables that were defined earlier. After that, I need to get a link that is provided to me. And again here, so there's actually no information. There's just this URL call. And then I have to use this link to upload the MP3 file. That means I receive this URL here from module number 62. Then I use the put method and upload the data from 11 labs here. I'll just quickly show this. Let me close this here. As you can see, this is basically data here, which is the binary version of the MP3 file. This is how it gets uploaded. Then so-called production is started, which basically means that I have to specify exactly how the whole thing works, what the file actually is, which episode ID it is, and then here it is created, and here the production is officially started. Starting a production means that Podigy takes care of all the rest, handling everything else for me. So the actual episode is created, and there's also an intro and an outro that I've uploaded to Podigy, which get attached to it, and that's how the actual episode is generated. In the end, though, it still has to be published and all the details still need to be entered. That means here I have a somewhat larger document where the title, the subtitle, the description, the number that is, the episode number, the season, and then this published at when this episode will actually be published, and the show notes are all included. Yes, and then in the end, the podcast is actually published, and you can see it's quite a nice story here that I've put together. And if we then listen to the whole thing, if you want to listen to it, you can do so on Spotify, on YouTube. This podcast is published everywhere. And yes, and then we also have the different episodes here, which we have published on our own website as well. Here I have the changelog. You can see here all the changes that I made. Yes. So for example, on December 19th, I had an error. On the 16th, there was something with the duplicates again. That means I also actually keep a record here of everything I change in these scenarios and in this automation. If you're interested in creating a podcast like this yourself, you can, of course, try to replicate it here. Or alternatively, you can also contact us. So that means under solutions, automated podcast on Pickert Day, you also find the option to contact us here. And yes, maybe it's an exciting story for you. And if you have any questions about it, just reach out to me as always. Of course, I would be happy if you not only subscribe to our YouTube channel, but also to the podcast and give me some feedback, because it really thrives on its listeners. And the feedback I receive there can gradually be incorporated into the podcast. So far, so good. I hope you enjoyed it, and please leave me a like and check out our other videos as well. And yes, today is December 29th. 2024. So wishing you a happy new year and a great start. Bye.